In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, where the sun blazed mercilessly over endless stretches of cattle ranches and the nearest doctor was 3 days' ride away, survival often depended on more than just luck. It was 1887, and the frontier was still wild, unforgiving, and full of dangers that could strike without warning. When death came slithering through the tall grass on a scorching summer afternoon, it would test not only one family's faith, but an entire community's deepest prejudices. What began as a simple walk to check on newborn calves would become a story that challenged everything the people of Cedar Ridge believed about healing, love, and the true meaning of salvation. Sometimes the very person a town fears most becomes the only one who can save what they hold most dear. The morning sun had barely crested the rolling hills when Margaret O'Sullivan stepped out of the sprawling ranch house, her boots clicking against the wooden porch steps. At 19, she possessed the kind of beauty that made traveling salesmen forget their words and cowboys stumble over their own feet. Her auburn hair caught the early light like spun copper, and her green eyes held the intelligence and determination that had made the O'Sullivan name respected throughout Texas territory. James O'Sullivan watched his daughter from the kitchen window as she headed toward the eastern pasture. He was a man carved from the same tough oak as the land he owned, with hands that had built this ranch from nothing and a reputation that stretched from Cedar Ridge to San Antonio. The Double S Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, making him one of the wealthiest men in 3 counties. But all his money and influence couldn't protect what he loved most from what was about to happen. Margaret walked with purpose through the dewy grass, her split riding skirt practical for ranch work. She carried a small basket and wore thick leather gloves, planning to check on the new calves that had been born during the night. The foreman had reported that one of their prize heifers had given birth to twins, and Margaret never missed an opportunity to see the new additions to their herd. Animals had always been her passion, much to her father's mixture of pride and concern. He often said she had a gift with creatures that others found difficult or dangerous. The eastern pasture stretched before her like a green carpet dotted with red and white cattle. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wildflowers and the distant promise of another scorching day. Margaret hummed softly as she walked, completely unaware that she was being watched by eyes older than the hills themselves. Hidden in the tall grass near the creek that ran through the pasture, a massive diamondback rattlesnake lay coiled and waiting. The serpent was ancient by snake standards, nearly 6 feet long and thick as a man's arm. Its diamond-patterned scales had darkened with age, and the rattle on its tail contained more segments than most people in Cedar Ridge had ever seen. The snake had been disturbed from its morning hunt by the approaching footsteps, and had assumed a defensive position, its body tense and ready to strike. Margaret spotted the twin calves near their mother about 50 yards from the creek. They were perfect specimens, already standing strong on wobbly legs and nursing eagerly. She smiled as she approached, speaking in the soft, melodic voice that seemed to calm even the most nervous animals. The mother cow looked up briefly, recognized Margaret's familiar presence, and returned to grazing peacefully. As Margaret knelt to examine the calves, checking their breathing and looking for any signs of weakness or injury, she noticed movement in her peripheral vision. What she initially thought might be a stick or piece of rope proved to be something far more sinister. The rattlesnake had moved closer, drawn by the vibrations in the ground and the unfamiliar scent of the human intruder. The sound that filled the air next was one that every person who had spent time on the frontier knew and feared: the dry, menacing rattle that announced the presence of death itself. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she slowly turned her head and saw the massive serpent coiled less than 3 feet away from her. Its head was raised in the classic striking position, its forked tongue flicking in and out as it tasted the air, and its black eyes fixed directly on her. Training and instinct warred within Margaret's mind. She knew she should remain perfectly still, but every fiber of her being screamed at her to run. The snake's rattle grew louder and more aggressive, its tail vibrating so fast it became a blur. Margaret could see the creature's fangs, curved and deadly, glistening with venom that could kill a grown man in minutes. Time seemed to stretch like molten glass as Margaret tried to decide her next move. She was too far from the fence line to make a run for it, and any sudden movement might trigger the snake's strike. Her father had taught her about rattlesnakes since she was a child, warning her that they could strike faster than the human eye could follow and that their reach extended nearly 2/3 of their body length. The standoff continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. The morning breeze rustled through the grass, and in the distance, Margaret could hear the sounds of the ranch coming to life. Cowboys were beginning their daily routines, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in the eastern pasture. The twin calves continued to nurse, oblivious to the danger that threatened their human guardian.
Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs as she slowly began to shift her weight backward, hoping to increase the distance between herself and the serpent without triggering an attack. The movement was so gradual that it was barely perceptible, but the snake's ancient instincts detected it immediately.
The rattling intensified, and the creature's head drew back slightly, coiling its body tighter like a spring preparing to release its deadly force. It was then that fate intervened in the cruelest possible way. One of the calves, startled by a butterfly that fluttered too close to its face, suddenly jumped sideways and bumped into Margaret's leg. The unexpected contact caused her to lose her balance, and as she instinctively threw out her hand to steady herself, she made the fatal mistake of moving too quickly. The rattlesnake struck with the speed of lightning, its fangs sinking deep into the soft flesh of Margaret's forearm just above her glove line. The pain was immediate and excruciating, like being stabbed by 2 red-hot needles.
Margaret screamed, a sound that carried across the pasture and sent birds exploding from their perches in the nearby trees. The snake, having delivered its venomous gift, quickly retreated into the tall grass near the creek, its rattle fading as it sought safety in the underbrush.
Margaret staggered backward, clutching her arm as she watched 2 small puncture wounds begin to swell and discolor. She could already feel the venom beginning its deadly work, a burning sensation that spread up her arm like liquid fire. Panic threatened to overwhelm her as she realized the gravity of her situation. The nearest doctor was in Austin, a 3-day journey by wagon under the best of circumstances. Even if her father could arrange for the fastest horse and rider, it would be too late. Everyone in cattle country knew that death from a large rattlesnake bite usually came within hours, sometimes less. Margaret's knees gave way, and she sank to the ground as the venom continued its relentless assault on her body. The burning sensation had reached her shoulder, and she could feel her heart racing as it tried to pump the poison through her bloodstream. Nausea rolled through her stomach, and her vision began to blur at the edges. With tremendous effort, she managed to get to her feet and began stumbling toward the ranch house, calling for help with every breath she could manage. Her voice, usually so strong and clear, came out as a weak, desperate cry that was nearly lost in the vastness of the pasture. The basket she had been carrying lay forgotten in the grass, and her legs felt increasingly unsteady with each step. Back at the ranch house, James O'Sullivan was reviewing the morning's work assignments with his foreman when a sound reached his ears that chilled him to the bone. It was his daughter's voice, but distorted by pain and terror in a way he had never heard before. He dropped the papers he was holding and ran toward the sound, his boots pounding against the hard-packed earth of the yard. What he saw when he reached the edge of the eastern pasture would haunt him for the rest of his life. His beautiful, vibrant daughter was stumbling toward him like a person drunk or severely ill. Her face was pale as winter snow, and she was clutching her left arm against her body. Even from a distance, he could see the telltale signs of swelling and discoloration that marked a venomous bite. James ran to her with the speed of a man half his age, reaching her just as her legs finally gave out completely. He caught her in his arms as she collapsed, and when he saw the 2 puncture wounds on her forearm, his heart nearly stopped. The flesh around the bite was already turning an ominous shade of purple, and the swelling was spreading rapidly up her arm. Margaret's eyes, usually so bright and full of life, were glazed with pain and the early effects of the venom. She tried to speak, but her words came out slurred and difficult to understand. James lifted her in his arms and began running toward the house, shouting orders to every ranch hand within hearing distance. The next hour passed in a blur of desperate activity. James sent his fastest rider to Austin to fetch the doctor, knowing even as he did so that it was likely a futile gesture. Margaret was placed in her bed, and the ranch hands took turns applying cold compresses to the bite, while James paced the floor like a caged animal. As word of the accident spread through Cedar Ridge, people began gathering at the ranch. Neighbors arrived with offers of help and suggestions for treatment, most of which were based on old wives' tales and frontier superstition. Some suggested cutting open the wound and trying to suck out the venom. Others recommended various poultices made from mud, tobacco, or herbs. None of these remedies had any real medical value, but they represented the desperate desire of the community to do something, anything, that might help. Margaret's condition continued to deteriorate throughout the morning. The swelling had spread to her shoulder and was beginning to affect her chest and neck. Her breathing became labored, and periods of consciousness were interrupted by spells of delirium where she spoke to people who weren't there and relived memories from her childhood. James sat beside his daughter's bed, holding her uninjured hand and trying to will his own strength into her failing body. He had built an empire from nothing, had faced down rustlers and outlaws,
had survived droughts and floods and financial disasters. But all his wealth and power were useless against the venom that was slowly stealing his daughter's life. As the afternoon sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing with it the promise of another brutally hot day, Margaret O'Sullivan lay dying in her childhood bedroom while an entire community watched helplessly.
The town's most prominent citizen had been brought low by something as simple as a walk through his own pasture, and death seemed to be claiming its victory with each labored breath she took. It was then, as hope was fading and the shadows were beginning to lengthen, that someone mentioned a name that most people in Cedar Ridge preferred to forget.
A name that belonged to a man who lived alone in the hills outside town. A man whose very existence made the good Christian folks uncomfortable, and whose methods they didn't understand or trust. But when death comes calling, even the most prejudiced hearts might be willing to consider salvation from an unexpected source.
Dr. Joseph Darkwater lived in a world caught between two cultures, belonging fully to neither but drawing strength from both. His cabin sat nestled in a grove of ancient oaks, 3 miles outside Cedar Ridge, close enough to serve the community when called upon, but far enough away to avoid the daily reminders that most folks barely tolerated his presence. At 32, he possessed the weathered hands of someone who had known hard work and the intelligent eyes of a man educated in both traditional Cherokee medicine and modern medical practices. His story began in the hills of North Carolina, where his Cherokee mother had fallen in love with a Scottish doctor who had come to tend to her people during a smallpox outbreak. Their union had produced a son who inherited his father's pale skin and his mother's dark hair and eyes, a combination that marked him as belonging to neither world completely.
When Joseph was 10, soldiers had come to remove the Cherokee from their ancestral lands, part of the forced march that history would remember as the Trail of Tears. Joseph's mother had died during that terrible journey, another victim of disease and despair that claimed thousands of lives. His father, heartbroken and consumed by guilt over his inability to save his wife and her people, had brought Joseph west to Texas, where they hoped to build a new life far from the memories that haunted them. The elder Darkwater had established a small medical practice in Austin, and Joseph had grown up learning both his father's scientific methods and the traditional Cherokee healing ways his mother had taught him before her death. When his father died 5 years earlier, Joseph had inherited his medical knowledge and his instruments, but also the burden of being a half-breed in a world that valued pure bloodlines. He had tried to practice medicine in Austin, but patients were few and far between. Most folks preferred doctors who looked like them and shared their beliefs about how healing should be accomplished. Reluctantly, Joseph had moved to the smaller community of Cedar Ridge, where his services were sometimes needed despite his heritage. The people of Cedar Ridge tolerated Joseph because they occasionally needed him, but their acceptance was grudging and conditional. When children fell ill with fever or men were injured in accidents, he was sometimes called upon to help, but he was never invited to social gatherings, never asked to join the church, never considered a true member of the community. He lived in the shadows of their society, useful when crisis demanded but invisible the rest of the time. On this particular morning, Joseph was preparing medicines from plants he had gathered in the hills. His cabin was filled with bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters and jars of various tinctures and powders lining the shelves. He followed the Cherokee tradition of gathering plants at specific times and in specific ways, always taking only what was needed, and always leaving offerings of tobacco or cornmeal for the plant spirits. Among his most prized possessions were several vials of antivenom he had prepared using methods taught to him by his Cherokee grandmother before the removal. The process was dangerous and complex, involving the careful milking of venom from captured snakes and the gradual introduction of small amounts into healthy animals until their blood developed immunity. Joseph was one of the few people in all of Texas who knew how to prepare and administer this traditional remedy, though most white doctors dismissed it as primitive superstition. The sound of a horse being ridden hard reached Joseph's ears around noon, and he looked up from his work to see a ranch hand from the Double S approaching his cabin at a full gallop. The man's face was flushed with exertion and worry, and his horse was lathered with sweat from the hard ride. Joseph stepped outside to meet the visitor, already suspecting that some emergency had brought the man to his door. Tommy Patterson had worked for James O'Sullivan for 3 years, and he was one of the few cowboys who had ever spoken to Joseph with anything approaching respect. Now he slid from his horse and approached the cabin with obvious urgency, his hat in his hands and his words tumbling over each other in his haste to explain the situation. Margaret O'Sullivan had been bitten by a massive rattlesnake, Tommy explained, his voice shaking with emotion. The bite was on her arm, and she was dying fast. The swelling had spread throughout her upper body, and she was slipping in and out of consciousness. They had sent someone to Austin for the doctor, but everyone knew he wouldn't arrive in time.
James O'Sullivan was desperate and willing to try anything, even if it meant asking for help from someone the town usually ignored. Joseph listened to the description of Margaret's condition with the detached professionalism he had learned from his father, but inside his chest his heart was racing. He had heard about the O'Sullivan girl, had seen her from a distance on the few occasions when he had been called to the ranch to treat injured animals. She was known throughout the territory for her beauty and kindness, and the thought of someone so young and full of life dying from a snake bite filled him with determination. Without hesitation, Joseph gathered his medical supplies and a vial of the precious anti-venom he had prepared. He saddled his horse, a sturdy paint mare named Medicine Walker, and followed Tommy back toward the Double S Ranch. As they rode, Tommy filled in more details about Margaret's condition, and Joseph's concern deepened with each piece of information. The snake that had bitten her was described as enormous, which meant it had likely injected a massive amount of venom. Time was running out, faster than sand through an hourglass. The ride to the ranch seemed to take forever, though it was probably less than 30 minutes. Joseph's mind raced through everything he knew about treating venomous snake bites, combining the scientific knowledge his father had taught him with the traditional Cherokee methods passed down through generations. The antivenom would be crucial, but timing and dosage would be critical. Too little, and it wouldn't counteract the venom. Too much could cause an allergic reaction that might kill the patient just as surely as the snake's poison. When they arrived at the Double S Ranch, Joseph was struck by the number of people gathered in the yard. Word of Margaret's condition had spread throughout Cedar Ridge, and neighbors had come to offer support and assistance. But as Joseph dismounted from his horse and approached the house, he noticed the subtle changes in the crowd's demeanor. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and people stepped back to create a clear path for him, but their faces showed a mixture of hope and suspicion. James O'Sullivan met Joseph at the front door, and the desperate gratitude in the wealthy rancher's eyes was almost overwhelming. This was a man who was used to being in control, who could solve most problems with money or influence. But his daughter's life hung in the balance, and he was willing to put aside years of prejudice and social convention if there was even a small chance that this half-breed doctor could help. Joseph was led through the elegant ranch house to Margaret's bedroom, where he got his first look at his patient. What he saw made his stomach tighten with concern. Margaret lay unconscious on her bed, her skin pale and clammy with sweat. The bite on her arm had caused swelling that extended from her fingertips to her shoulder, and the discoloration indicated that the venom was spreading rapidly through her system. Kneeling beside the bed, Joseph began his examination with gentle but thorough precision. He checked Margaret's pulse, which was rapid and weak, and listened to her breathing, which had become shallow and labored. The pupils of her eyes were dilated, and when he lifted her eyelids, he could see the telltale signs of venom poisoning affecting her nervous system. James O'Sullivan hovered nearby, along with several other family members and ranch employees who had crowded into the room. Their presence made Joseph's work more difficult, but he understood their need to be close to Margaret during this crisis. He asked for a basin of clean water and some cloth, then began cleaning the bite wound with gentle but thorough care. The 2 puncture wounds were clearly visible, surrounded by tissue that had turned an alarming shade of purple-black. Joseph could feel the heat radiating from the inflamed skin, and when he pressed gently around the bite area, clear fluid mixed with blood oozed from the wounds. The amount of venom that had been injected was obviously substantial, and Margaret's body was losing the battle against the poison that was attacking her blood and nervous system. Joseph knew that he was Margaret's only chance for survival, but he also knew that his treatment would be met with skepticism and possibly outright hostility from some of the observers. Cherokee medicine was often viewed as primitive superstition by white settlers, and the antivenom he carried was prepared using methods that most people didn't understand. But there was no time to explain or justify his approach. Every minute that passed allowed the venom to do more damage to Margaret's body. Reaching into his medical bag, Joseph withdrew the vial of antivenom and a specially prepared syringe. The antivenom was a pale yellow liquid that had taken months to prepare, and it represented his best hope of counteracting the snake's venom. But administering it required precise calculation based on Margaret's weight, the estimated amount of venom injected, and the time that had passed since the bite. As Joseph prepared the injection, he became aware of the hushed conversations taking place behind him. Some people were expressing amazement that a half-breed might actually be able to help, while others were voicing doubts about trusting their beloved Margaret to someone who practiced Indian medicine. Joseph tried to block out the whispers and focus on his patient, but he could feel the weight of their expectations and prejudices pressing down on him like a physical force. The injection of antivenom had to be given slowly and carefully, and Joseph watched Margaret's face for any signs of an allergic reaction as the medicine entered her bloodstream.
For several long minutes, there was no change in her condition, and Joseph could feel the hope in the room beginning to fade. Some of the observers started murmuring that the treatment wasn't working, that they should have waited for a real doctor from Austin. Then Joseph began the second part of his treatment, drawing on the Cherokee healing traditions his mother had taught him. He prepared a poultice using specific plants he had gathered from the hills, combining them with clay from a sacred spring and other ingredients that had been used by his people for generations to treat snake bites. The mixture was applied directly to the bite wound and covered with clean cloth. Next, Joseph began a soft chanting in the Cherokee language, a healing song that was meant to drive the poison from Margaret's body and restore the balance between her spirit and the natural world. The sound of the ancient words filled the bedroom, and several of the observers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether they were witnessing medicine or some kind of heathen ritual. But James O'Sullivan, watching his daughter's face with the intensity of a man whose world hung in the balance, noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. Margaret's breathing seemed to be getting stronger, and some of the terrible pallor was beginning to fade from her cheeks. The swelling in her arm didn't appear to be spreading any further, and when Joseph checked her pulse again, it was slightly stronger and more regular. For the next several hours, Joseph maintained his vigil beside Margaret's bed, monitoring her condition and adjusting his treatment as needed. He administered additional doses of antivenom at carefully calculated intervals and changed the poultices as they drew out the poison and inflammation from the bite wound. Throughout the long afternoon and into the evening, he worked with the quiet determination of someone who understood that failure meant losing not just a patient, but any hope of acceptance in this community. As the sun began to set outside Margaret's bedroom window, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, something remarkable began to happen. Margaret's eyelids fluttered, and she made a soft sound that indicated consciousness was returning. James O'Sullivan leaned forward eagerly, calling his daughter's name in a voice thick with emotion. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, and though they were still clouded with pain and confusion, they focused on her father's face with obvious recognition. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and her voice came out as barely a whisper. Joseph gently lifted her head and gave her small sips of water mixed with willow bark tea, a Cherokee remedy for pain and inflammation. The room erupted in quiet celebration as word spread that Margaret was conscious and responding. People who had been maintaining a death watch suddenly found themselves witnesses to what seemed like a miracle. The half-breed doctor whom many had doubted had succeeded where conventional medicine would have failed. Margaret O'Sullivan was going to live. But even as the immediate crisis passed, Joseph could see the complicated emotions playing across the faces of the people in the room. Relief and gratitude warred with discomfort and prejudice. They were thankful that Margaret had been saved, but the fact that her salvation had come from someone they had always considered inferior created a cognitive dissonance that many found difficult to process. James O'Sullivan approached Joseph as he packed his medical supplies, his face showing a mixture of profound gratitude and obvious confusion. This was a man whose entire worldview had been challenged by the events of the day. The half-breed he had barely tolerated as a neighbor had proven more capable than any white doctor in saving his daughter's life. The implications of that reality would take time to fully sink in. As news of Margaret's recovery spread beyond the ranch house and into the town of Cedar Ridge, Joseph knew that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet predict. He had saved the life of the most beloved young woman in the community, using methods that most people didn't understand or trust. The question now was whether that act would earn him acceptance or create new problems that might be even more dangerous than the snake that had started it all. The weeks following Margaret's recovery were unlike anything Cedar Ridge had ever experienced. Word of the miraculous healing spread like wildfire across Texas, carried by travelers, merchants, and cowboys who had witnessed or heard about the half-breed doctor who had saved James O'Sullivan's daughter when white medicine would have failed. The story grew in the telling, becoming the stuff of legend throughout the territory. Margaret's recovery was slow but steady. The massive amount of venom that had coursed through her body left her weak and exhausted for days after regaining consciousness. Joseph visited the ranch daily during those first crucial weeks, monitoring her progress and adjusting her treatment as needed. Each visit revealed improvements that amazed everyone who had seen her near death. The bite wound itself healed cleanly under Joseph's care, leaving only 2 small scars on Margaret's forearm that would serve as permanent reminders of her brush with death. The Cherokee poultices had drawn out the last traces of poison and inflammation, and the antivenom had neutralized the venom before it could cause permanent damage to her organs. Within a month, Margaret was walking around the ranch house, though she still tired easily and needed frequent rest. During these visits, something unexpected began to develop between the patient and her healer. Margaret had always been curious about the world beyond the narrow confines of ranch life, and Joseph's knowledge of both traditional Cherokee culture and modern medicine fascinated her. She asked endless questions about his background, his training, and the methods he had used to save her life.
Joseph found himself looking forward to these conversations more than he cared to admit. Margaret possessed an intelligence and openness that was rare in his experience with white settlers.
She listened without judgment when he explained Cherokee beliefs about the connection between physical and spiritual health, and she showed genuine interest in learning about medicinal plants and their traditional uses. As Margaret grew stronger, she began accompanying Joseph on walks around the ranch property, learning to identify the various herbs and plants he used in his practice. These expeditions always took place within sight of the ranch house, with Margaret's father's blessing, but under the watchful eyes of ranch hands who had been instructed to maintain a discreet distance. James O'Sullivan was caught in an impossible position during this time. His gratitude to Joseph was genuine and profound, but accepting a half-breed as a regular visitor to his home challenged every social convention he had ever known. The wealthy rancher found himself torn between his debt to the man who had saved his daughter and the expectations of a society that viewed such relationships with deep suspicion. The town of Cedar Ridge was similarly divided in its response to recent events. Many residents were genuinely grateful that Margaret had been saved, and some even began to reconsider their assumptions about Joseph's abilities and character. The fact that he had succeeded where conventional medicine would have failed forced people to acknowledge that perhaps their prejudices had been unfounded. But not everyone was prepared to embrace such a dramatic change in perspective. A significant portion of the community remained suspicious of Joseph's methods and uncomfortable with the attention he was receiving. Some whispered that he had used witchcraft rather than medicine, while others suggested that the devil himself had intervened to deceive good Christian folks into trust in a heathen. The local preacher, Reverend Samuel Thornton, was particularly troubled by the implications of Margaret's healing. A man in his 50s with a stern demeanor and unwavering faith in his own righteousness, Thornton had built his reputation on clear distinctions between good and evil, godly and ungodly, Christian and heathen. Joseph's success challenged these simple categories and threatened the moral authority that Thornton had spent years establishing. From the pulpit of the Cedar Ridge Community Church, Reverend Thornton began delivering sermons that warned against placing trust in those who practiced dark arts, and reminded his congregation that the devil often appeared in appealing forms to lead the faithful astray. While he never mentioned Joseph by name, everyone understood the target of his increasingly pointed messages. These sermons found a receptive audience among those who were already uncomfortable with the changing dynamics in their community. Led by influential figures like banker Harrison Caldwell and store owner Milton Webb, a group began forming that was determined to restore what they saw as the proper order of things. They argued that allowing a half-breed to gain prominence in their community would set a dangerous precedent that could threaten the social stability they had worked to establish. Margaret was unaware of much of this underlying tension during the early weeks of her recovery, but as she grew stronger and began venturing beyond the ranch property, she started to sense the undercurrents of conflict that were dividing the town. Some people greeted her with warmth and relief, expressing genuine happiness that she had survived her ordeal. But others seemed uncomfortable in her presence, as if her association with Joseph had somehow tainted her in their eyes. The first real indication of trouble came during a visit to the town's general store, where Margaret had gone to purchase supplies for the ranch. She was examining bolts of fabric when she overheard a conversation between two women that stopped her cold. The women were discussing her recovery, but their tone was far from celebratory. One woman suggested that Margaret's survival had come at too high a price, that accepting help from that Cherokee had somehow compromised her and her family's standing in the community. The other woman agreed, adding that she wondered what kind of hold the half-breed might have over the O'Sullivan family now that they were in his debt. Margaret felt her cheeks burning with anger and embarrassment as she listened to the cruel speculation. These were women who had known her since childhood, who had attended her birthday parties and praised her accomplishments. Now they were treating her survival as something shameful, something that had diminished rather than blessed her family. When Margaret returned to the ranch and told her father about the conversation, James O'Sullivan's face darkened with rage. He was a proud man who had never tolerated disrespect toward his family, but this situation presented unique challenges. How could he defend his daughter without acknowledging the debt they owed to someone most of the community viewed as inferior? The tension came to a head during the town's annual Harvest Festival, a celebration that normally brought the entire community together in fellowship and thanksgiving. This year, however, the festival became a stage for the conflicts that had been simmering beneath the surface since Margaret's recovery. Joseph had not planned to attend the festival, knowing that his presence would likely create discomfort for many people. But Margaret, who was feeling strong enough to participate in community activities for the first time since her accident, specifically asked him to come. She was tired of hiding their friendship and wanted to publicly acknowledge the man who had saved her life. Against his better judgment, Joseph agreed to attend, though he arrived late and kept to the edges of the crowd. The festival was in full swing, with families enjoying food, music, and games in the town square. Children ran between the booths while adults caught up on gossip and conducted business in the relaxed atmosphere of the celebration. Margaret sought out Joseph as soon as she spotted him, approaching him with a warm smile and obvious pleasure at seeing him. Their conversation was friendly and animated, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Here was the most eligible young woman in 3 counties, speaking to a half-breed with the same ease and respect she showed to any white man. The sight proved too much for some observers to tolerate. Reverend Thornton, who had been watching the interaction with growing disapproval, decided that divine intervention was required to prevent further corruption of the community's moral fiber. He approached Margaret and Joseph with purposeful strides, his black coat billowing behind him like the wings of an avenging angel. The confrontation that followed would be remembered and discussed in Cedar Ridge for years to come. Reverend Thornton positioned himself between Margaret and Joseph, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet festival grounds as he demanded to know why a good Christian girl was consorting with someone who practiced heathen rituals and dark magic. Margaret's response shocked everyone who heard it, including Joseph himself. With a voice that carried all the authority of her father's name and her own strong personality, she told Reverend Thornton that Joseph Darkwater was a skilled doctor who had saved her life using legitimate medical knowledge. She challenged anyone present to explain why gratitude and friendship should be considered sinful when directed towards someone whose only crime was being born with mixed heritage. The crowd that gathered around them included virtually everyone at the festival, and the division in the community became visible in their faces. Some people nodded in agreement with Margaret's words, while others looked scandalized by her public defense of the half-breed. Children sensed the tension without understanding its source, and even the festival musicians stopped playing to listen to the dramatic confrontation. Joseph tried to defuse the situation by suggesting that he should leave, but Margaret refused to let him retreat. Standing beside him with her chin raised in defiance, she declared that if the community couldn't accept the man who had saved her life, then perhaps she didn't belong in such a community either. Her words sent a collective gasp through the crowd as people realized that the beloved Margaret O'Sullivan was essentially choosing the half-breed over the town that had raised her. The implications of such a choice were staggering, threatening to tear apart relationships and alliances that had existed for years. James O'Sullivan, who had been watching the confrontation from across the square, now pushed through the crowd to reach his daughter. His face was unreadable as he surveyed the tense scene, and everyone waited to see whether the most powerful man in the territory would support his daughter or side with community pressure. What happened next surprised everyone, including Margaret herself. James O'Sullivan placed his hand on Joseph's shoulder and addressed the crowd in a voice that carried the weight of absolute authority. He reminded everyone present that his daughter was alive only because of Joseph's skill and courage, and that any man who had accomplished such a feat deserved respect rather than suspicion. But even as James defended Joseph publicly, he knew that his words were creating new problems that would require careful navigation. By supporting the half-breed doctor, he was challenging social conventions that many people considered sacred. The consequences of that choice would extend far beyond the festival grounds, affecting business relationships, political alliances, and social connections throughout the territory. As the crowd slowly dispersed and the festival resumed its normal activities, Margaret and Joseph found themselves at the center of a storm that was only beginning to build. Their friendship, which had developed naturally during her recovery, was now seen as a symbol of larger conflicts about race, religion, and social order that had been lurking beneath the surface of frontier life. Neither Margaret nor Joseph fully understood the forces they had unleashed, but both sensed that their lives were about to change in ways that would test their courage, their convictions, and their commitment to each other. The healing of Margaret's snakebite had been relatively simple compared to the healing that their community would need to overcome the divisions that were now threatening to tear it apart. The festival ended that evening with an undercurrent of tension that cast a shadow over what should have been a joyful celebration. As families packed up their belongings and headed home, conversations buzzed with speculation about what the public confrontation might mean for the future of Cedar Ridge. Margaret and Joseph walked together to the edge of town, where their paths would diverge toward their respective homes. The conversation between them was subdued, both realizing that their friendship had become a public issue that would no longer be allowed to develop quietly in the background.
As they said goodnight, neither could have predicted that forces were already in motion that would soon make their personal choice a matter of community survival, or that the question of their relationship would ultimately be decided not by their own hearts, but by the collective will of a town struggling to define its own identity. The weeks following the Harvest Festival confrontation brought an escalating series of events that would test every relationship in Cedar Ridge. What had started as whispered conversations and sideways glances evolved into open hostility that divided families, split business partnerships, and challenged the very foundation of the community that had taken years to build. Reverend Thornton emerged as the leader of those who viewed Margaret's friendship with Joseph as a dangerous precedent that threatened the social order they had worked to establish on the frontier. From his pulpit, he delivered increasingly inflammatory sermons that portrayed the situation as a battle between Christian civilization and heathen influences. He spoke of contamination and corruption, using biblical references to support his argument that allowing such relationships would invite divine punishment upon the entire community. The Reverend's words found eager reception among those who had always been uncomfortable with Joseph's presence in their midst. Banker Harrison Caldwell, who controlled much of the town's financial activity, began suggesting that businesses should reconsider their relationships with anyone who supported the half-breed doctor. Store owner Milton Webb started refusing to serve customers who spoke favorably of Joseph, and several other merchants followed his example. But the opposition to Margaret and Joseph's friendship was not universal. Dr. Samuel Morrison, the elderly physician who had served Cedar Ridge before his retirement, publicly defended Joseph's medical skills and criticized those who would allow prejudice to override common sense. Several ranchers who had benefited from Joseph's veterinary services also spoke in his defense, arguing that his heritage was less important than his abilities. The town found itself split into two increasingly hostile camps, with former friends and neighbors taking opposite sides based on their attitudes toward race, religion, and social change. Business transactions became political statements, social gatherings turned into debates about fundamental values, and even children began choosing sides based on their families' positions. Margaret herself became the center of attention in ways that made her deeply uncomfortable. Every appearance in town was scrutinized for signs of her relationship with Joseph, and every conversation was analyzed for clues about her true feelings. Some people treated her with the reverence due to someone who had survived a miraculous healing, while others looked at her with suspicion, as if her association with the half-breed had somehow diminished her worth. The pressure on Margaret intensified when several of the town's most eligible young men began making obvious attempts to court her, clearly hoping to provide an alternative to her controversial friendship. These suitors included Robert Caldwell, the banker's son who had recently returned from college in the East, and David Preston, whose family owned the largest general store in the neighboring county. These young men were everything that frontier society valued in potential husbands. They were white, Christian, well-educated, and financially secure. Their interest in Margaret was genuine, and their family support would have provided her with a comfortable and socially acceptable future. But Margaret found herself comparing every suitor to Joseph, measuring their intelligence against his deep understanding of both scientific and traditional knowledge, and finding them all lacking in the qualities she had come to value most. James O'Sullivan watched his daughter navigate these complicated social pressures with growing concern. As a father, he wanted her happiness above all else. But as a businessman and community leader, he understood the costs that her choices might impose on their entire family. The O'Sullivan name carried significant weight throughout Texas territory, but even their wealth and influence might not be enough to protect them if the community turned completely against them. The situation reached a crisis point when Reverend Thornton called for a special town meeting to address what he termed the moral crisis threatening our community's Christian foundation. The meeting was scheduled for a Sunday evening in the church, and virtually every adult in Cedar Ridge was expected to attend. The announcement made it clear that the purpose was to discuss the relationship between Margaret O'Sullivan and Joseph Darkwater, though neither was specifically mentioned by name. Margaret learned about the meeting from her father, who had received a formal invitation along with every other prominent family in the area. James had tried to protect his daughter from the worst of the community pressure, but he could no longer shield her from the reality that their neighbors were preparing to sit in judgment of her personal choices. The night of the meeting, the Cedar Ridge Community Church was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding into the aisles. The atmosphere was tense and charged with emotion, as if the entire community had gathered to witness a trial whose outcome would determine their collective future. Reverend Thornton opened the meeting with a lengthy prayer, asking for divine guidance in addressing the challenges facing their community. His words were carefully chosen, but clearly directed toward the specific situation that had brought everyone together. He spoke of the need to maintain moral standards, the dangers of accepting ungodly influences, and the responsibility of good Christians to protect their community from corruption.
When the prayer ended, the Reverend outlined the concerns that had prompted the meeting. He spoke about the influence that the half-breed doctor had gained over one of their most prominent families, the dangerous precedent that accepting such relationships might set, and the potential consequences for their community's reputation throughout the territory. The floor was then open for comments from community members, and what followed was a passionate debate that revealed the depth of division within Cedar Ridge.
Harrison Caldwell spoke eloquently about the need to maintain standards and warned that accepting mixed-race relationships would attract the wrong kind of attention from territorial authorities. Milton Webb shared stories he claimed to have heard about other communities that had been destroyed by similar compromises of their moral foundation.
But the opposition also had strong voices. Dr. Morrison reminded the gathering that Joseph had saved Margaret's life when conventional medicine would have failed, and suggested that gratitude rather than suspicion should be the community's response. Several ranchers testified to Joseph's skill in treating their animals and his honest dealings in all business matters.
The most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source.
Mary Holloway, the widow whose son had been saved by Joseph's treatment of pneumonia the previous winter, stood to address the meeting despite her obvious nervousness about speaking in such a public forum.
Her voice shook with emotion as she described watching her child struggle to breathe, knowing that death was approaching, and feeling helpless to prevent it.
Joseph had arrived when called, she explained, despite the late hour and difficult weather conditions. He had worked through the night using both traditional and modern methods to break her son's fever and clear his lungs. By morning, the crisis had passed, and her boy had made a full recovery.
She challenged anyone present to explain why the color of Joseph's skin mattered more than his ability to save lives. The testimony created a stir among the assembled crowd, as people were reminded that the half-breed doctor had helped many families in their community. But Reverend Thornton quickly regained control of the meeting, arguing that individual acts of healing did not justify compromising the moral standards that protected their entire way of life. As the debate continued, it became clear that the meeting's real purpose was not to gather opinions but to build support for a predetermined course of action. Reverend Thornton and his allies had developed a plan to pressure the O'Sullivan family into ending Margaret's association with Joseph, using economic and social sanctions to force compliance. The plan was presented as a community decision made for the greater good. Businesses would be encouraged to reconsider their relationships with anyone who supported inappropriate racial mixing. Social organizations would review their membership policies to ensure they reflected proper Christian values, and families would be expected to guide their children away from associations that might compromise their moral development. While Joseph's name was never specifically mentioned, everyone understood that the proposals were designed to isolate him from the community and make it impossible for him to continue practicing medicine in Cedar Ridge. The message to the O'Sullivan family was equally clear. End Margaret's friendship with the half-breed, or face the consequences of social and economic ostracism. James O'Sullivan sat through the entire meeting without speaking, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as he listened to his neighbors debate his daughter's future. When Reverend Thornton finally called for a formal vote on the proposed measures, James rose from his seat and requested permission to address the meeting. The church fell silent as the territory's most influential rancher walked to the front of the room. Every person present understood that his words would carry enormous weight in determining the final outcome. Some expected him to capitulate to community pressure and abandon his support for Joseph. Others hoped he would use his influence to defend his daughter's right to choose her own friends. What James said next surprised everyone in the room, including his own daughter. He began by acknowledging his deep love for his daughter and his gratitude to the man who had saved her life. He spoke about the frontier values of judging people by their actions rather than their ancestry, and reminded the gathering that their community had been built by individuals who refused to accept the limitations that society had tried to impose on them. But then James delivered an ultimatum that left everyone stunned. He announced that if the community insisted on forcing his family to choose between their social standing and their principles, they would make that choice gladly. The O'Sullivan family would not be dictated to by fear and prejudice, and they were prepared to face whatever consequences their neighbors might impose. However, James continued, there was another option that might satisfy everyone's concerns while preserving both his daughter's happiness and the community's sense of moral order. If the issue was the impropriety of an unmarried woman maintaining a close friendship with an unmarried man of different race, then perhaps the solution was to make their relationship socially acceptable through marriage. The suggestion sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. James O'Sullivan was proposing that his daughter marry the half-breed doctor, legitimizing their relationship while challenging every social convention the community held sacred.
The idea was so unexpected that it took several moments for people to fully comprehend what they had heard. Margaret herself was among those caught completely off guard by her father's proposal. She had never discussed marriage with Joseph, and while she cared deeply about him, she had not considered the possibility that their friendship might develop into something more formal. The realization that her father was publicly suggesting such a union left her feeling overwhelmed and uncertain. Reverend Thornton was the first to respond, his voice rising with indignation as he declared that sanctifying an ungodly union through marriage would only compound the sin rather than resolve it. He argued that mixing races was contrary to biblical teaching and natural law, and that approving such a marriage would invite divine retribution upon their entire community. But James was not finished. He reminded the gathering that Joseph Darkwater was a skilled physician whose abilities had been proven beyond doubt. He was honest, hard-working, and had shown nothing but respect for their community's values, even when faced with suspicion and hostility. If marriage was what it took to make his presence acceptable, then James was prepared to give his blessing to such a union. The meeting erupted into chaos as people realized that James O'Sullivan was essentially forcing them to choose between accepting a mixed-race marriage or losing the most influential family in their community. Some shouted their opposition while others argued for acceptance. The debate that had started as a discussion about community values had become a battle for the very soul of Cedar Ridge. As arguments raged around her, Margaret sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications of her father's words. Her life had been transformed from a simple snake bite into a symbol of larger conflicts about race, religion, and social change. Now she faced the possibility that her personal choices might determine not only her own future, but the future of everyone she had known since childhood. The meeting ended without resolution, but everyone understood that a line had been crossed from which there could be no return. The community would have to decide whether it could accept a mixed-race marriage among its most prominent families, or whether the price of maintaining racial purity was worth losing the O'Sullivans entirely. As people filed out of the church into the cool night air, conversations buzzed with speculation about what would happen next. Some families were already making plans to leave Cedar Ridge if the marriage took place, while others were reconsidering their opposition in light of James O'Sullivan's ultimatum. Margaret and her father rode home in silence, both overwhelmed by the evening's events and uncertain about what the morning might bring. Neither had spoken to Joseph about the possibility of marriage, and both wondered how he would react to learning that his future had become the subject of community-wide debate. The stage was now set for a final confrontation that would test every relationship in Cedar Ridge and determine whether a frontier community built on individual freedom could transcend the racial prejudices that had shaped American society for generations. The answer would come not from speeches or votes, but from the choices made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. The morning after the church meeting dawned grey and overcast, reflecting the mood that had settled over Cedar Ridge like a heavy blanket. Margaret woke to find her father already dressed and waiting in the kitchen, his face showing the weight of the decision that lay ahead. They both knew that before another sunset, their lives would be forever changed by choices that could not be undone. James had spent the sleepless night wrestling with the implications of his public ultimatum. As a businessman, he understood the potential costs of alienating powerful members of his community. As a father, he was tormented by the possibility that he had forced his daughter into an impossible situation. But as a man who had built his life on the principle that actions mattered more than ancestry, he could not bring himself to regret his stand. Margaret sat across from her father at the breakfast table, neither of them able to eat much despite the efforts of their cook to provide comfort through food. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and concerns. Finally, Margaret found her voice and asked the question that had kept her awake all night. What if Joseph refused the marriage proposal that had been made so publicly on his behalf? It was a valid concern. Joseph had never expressed romantic feelings toward Margaret, and their friendship, while deep and meaningful, had developed during a time when she was recovering from a traumatic injury. The idea of marriage had been thrust upon them by community pressure rather than arising naturally from their own emotions. There was no guarantee that Joseph would be willing to accept a union that was being imposed rather than chosen. James acknowledged his daughter's concerns but reminded her that Joseph was in an impossible position regardless of his personal feelings. The community had made it clear that his presence would no longer be tolerated unless he could somehow legitimize his relationship with the O'Sullivan family. Marriage represented his only path to social acceptance, but it also meant giving up any hope of finding love on his own terms. Around mid-morning,
a messenger arrived at the ranch with word that Joseph was waiting at the creek that marked the eastern boundary of O'Sullivan land.
He had apparently learned about the previous evening's meeting and wanted to speak with Margaret and her father before any further decisions were made. The location he had chosen was significant, as it was near the spot where Margaret had been bitten by the rattlesnake that had started this entire chain of events. Margaret and her father rode to the creek together, finding Joseph standing beside the water, with his horse grazing nearby. His face showed the strain of the impossible situation he found himself in, but his bearing remained dignified despite the circumstances.
He greeted them both with the same respectful courtesy he had always shown, though his eyes revealed the turmoil beneath his calm exterior. The conversation that followed would be remembered by all three participants as one of the most difficult and important of their lives. Joseph began by acknowledging what he had learnt about the community meeting and expressing his regret that his presence had caused such division among people who had been neighbours and friends for years. He offered to leave Cedar Ridge immediately, removing himself as a source of conflict and allowing life to return to normal. Margaret's response surprised both men with its vehemence. She declared that she would not allow the community's prejudice to drive away the man who had saved her life, and that if Joseph left, she would consider it a betrayal of everything she believed about justice and gratitude. Her words revealed depths of feeling that she had not previously expressed, and both Joseph and her father realized that her attachment to the Cherokee doctor was stronger than anyone had understood. James watched the interaction between his daughter and Joseph with new eyes, seeing for the first time the genuine affection that had developed between them during the weeks of her recovery. What he had initially viewed as friendship based on gratitude was clearly something deeper and more complex. The realization both relieved and concerned him, as it suggested that a marriage between them might be based on real feeling rather than mere convenience. Joseph listened to Margaret's passionate words with obvious emotion, but his response was measured and thoughtful. He explained that he cared deeply about both Margaret and her father, and that his gratitude for their acceptance and friendship was beyond expression. But he also understood the costs that such a friendship imposed on them, and he was not willing to allow his presence to destroy relationships they had built over years of life in this community. The discussion that followed explored every possible option for resolving their dilemma. They could defy the community openly and face the consequences together. They could separate and hope that time would heal the divisions that had emerged, or they could accept the solution that James had proposed the previous evening and unite their lives through marriage, legitimizing their relationship while challenging the community to accept what they could not prevent. As they talked, it became clear that marriage represented both the most practical and the most dangerous choice available to them. It would provide social legitimacy for their relationship and might eventually lead to acceptance within the community. But it would also make their union a permanent symbol of racial integration that could attract attention and hostility from far beyond Cedar Ridge.
Joseph was the first to address the personal dimensions of the decision they faced.
He admitted that his feelings for Margaret had grown beyond friendship during the weeks they had spent together, but he was not willing to enter into marriage unless she felt similarly. He had seen too many unions based on convenience rather than affection, and he refused to trap Margaret in a relationship that might bring her only regret. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. She told Joseph that she had come to care for him more deeply than she had ever cared for any man, and that she could not imagine her life without his presence in it. If marriage was what it took to preserve their relationship and satisfy the community's concerns, she was prepared to take that step willingly and gladly. With both young people having expressed their willingness to marry, James gave his formal blessing to the union, while acknowledging the challenges they would face. He promised to use all of his influence to gain acceptance for the marriage within the community, and he pledged that the full resources of the O'Sullivan name and fortune would be available to protect them from any external threats that might emerge. The decision made, they turned to the practical questions of timing and ceremony. Given the controversial nature of the union, a quiet wedding seemed preferable to a public celebration that might inflame community tensions. But Margaret surprised both men by insisting that their marriage should be conducted openly, with the entire community invited to witness their commitment to each other. Her reasoning was both strategic and principled. A secret wedding would suggest shame about their choice, while a public ceremony would demonstrate confidence in the rightness of their decision. If they truly believed that their marriage was legitimate and moral, then they should be willing to proclaim it openly and invite their neighbors to share in their happiness. Joseph and James both recognized the wisdom in Margaret's position, though they also understood the risks involved. A public wedding would force every member of the community to take a clear stand either for or against the union, eliminating the possibility of neutral ground. Some people who might have eventually accepted the marriage in private might feel compelled to oppose it if forced to make a public choice.
Nevertheless, they agreed to Margaret's proposal, and plans were made for a wedding ceremony to be held the following Sunday in the Cedar Ridge Community Church. Reverend Thornton would be asked to perform the ceremony, though they all understood that he would likely refuse. If necessary, they would find another minister or even a civil official to conduct the service. Word of the planned wedding spread through Cedar Ridge like wildfire, creating intense debate and discussion in every home and business. Families found themselves divided as parents and children, husbands and wives, took different positions on whether they should attend the ceremony. Some saw the wedding as an abomination that would bring shame upon their community, while others viewed it as an act of courage that demonstrated the frontier values of individual freedom and merit-based judgment. The week leading up to the wedding became a test of relationships throughout the territory. Business partners dissolved their associations based on their disagreement about the marriage. Church members threatened to leave the congregation if the ceremony took place in their sanctuary. Old friendships ended as people discovered that their fundamental values were incompatible. Reverend Thornton did indeed refuse to perform the wedding ceremony, declaring that he could not in good conscience sanctify a union that he believed violated both biblical teaching and natural law. His refusal prompted a search for an alternative minister that proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. Several preachers from neighboring communities declined to become involved in such a controversial ceremony. Eventually, Dr. Morrison suggested a solution that satisfied everyone's needs while avoiding further religious controversy. Judge William Harvey, who traveled the circuit court system throughout the territory, was known for his pragmatic approach to frontier law and his belief in individual rights. He agreed to perform a civil ceremony that would be legally binding while avoiding the religious conflicts that had made church wedding impossible. As the wedding day approached, Margaret and Joseph found themselves at the center of attention that extended far beyond Cedar Ridge. News of the controversial marriage had spread throughout Texas territory, attracting reporters, curiosity seekers, and activists from both sides of the racial divide. Some came to support the couple's right to marry across racial lines, while others came to protest what they saw as a dangerous precedent that threatened social order. The O'Sullivan Ranch became a gathering point for supporters of the marriage, with several prominent figures arriving to show their solidarity with the couple's choice. These included Dr. Jack Prick, Morrison and his family, several ranchers who had benefited from Joseph's medical services, and a surprising number of women who admired Margaret's courage in following her heart despite social pressure. Sunday morning arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures that seemed to bless the controversial ceremony. The Cedar Ridge Community Church was packed to capacity, with people who had come to witness history being made. The crowd included both supporters and opponents of the marriage, creating an atmosphere of tension that crackled with potential for conflict. Margaret appeared radiant as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, wearing a simple but elegant dress that had belonged to her mother. Joseph waited at the altar in his best suit, his bearing dignified and proud despite the hostile stares of many in the congregation. Judge Harvey stood ready to perform the ceremony, his presence lending official authority to proceedings that many considered illegitimate. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, with Margaret and Joseph exchanging vows that spoke of their commitment to love and honor each other regardless of the challenges they might face. When Judge Harvey pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted in a mixture of applause and angry murmurs that reflected the community's fundamental division. As the newly married couple walked back down the aisle together, they could see the faces that would define their future in Cedar Ridge. Some people smiled and offered congratulations, while others turned away in obvious disapproval. The battle for their community's acceptance was far from over, but they had taken the irreversible step of uniting their lives in the face of overwhelming opposition. The reception that followed was held at the O'Sullivan Ranch, attended by those who chose to support the marriage despite social pressure to stay away. The gathering included a surprisingly diverse group of people who had found common ground in their belief that love and merit should matter more than race or social convention. But even as Margaret and Joseph celebrated their wedding day, surrounded by friends and supporters, both understood that their real challenges were just beginning. They had succeeded in legitimizing their relationship through marriage, but they had not changed the fundamental attitudes that had made such legitimization necessary. The years ahead would test their love, their commitment, and their community's capacity for growth and change. As the sun set on their wedding day, Margaret and Joseph stood together on the porch of the ranch house, looking out over the land that would be their home and the community that would be their testing ground. They had chosen love over convention, courage over comfort, and hope over fear. The consequences of those choices would unfold in the days and years to come, shaping not only their own lives but the future of everyone who called Cedar Ridge home. Their story had begun with a snake bite that threatened death, continued with healing that defied expectations, and culminated in a marriage that challenged everything their community believed about race, religion, and social order. Whether their union would ultimately strengthen or destroy the fabric of frontier society remained to be seen, but there was no doubt that Margaret O'Sullivan Darkwater and her Cherokee husband had changed their world forever.